Okay, welcome to your next video lecture, looking at some of the major battles in the Western Front and also trench warfare and some of the new technology of the war. So beginning with the Western Front itself, one thing to point out is it says here Western battlefields from 1914 to 1918. I just don't like this, a little bit too thin for me. Okay, I'm going to outline that for you, just to kind of give you an idea. So it's called a world war, but I mean, it's really happening, at least on the Western Front, in a very, very small area. So I always joke about a war over 100 miles of mud. You can see that I'm being pretty serious when I'm talking about that. The other thing is, here's Germany. The war itself didn't actually happen in Germany. The Rhine River tends to be the dividing line between France and Germany itself. So the war itself, all the damage, all the shelling, didn't actually happen within Germany's borders. It was happening in northern France and, of course, in Belgium. So just getting rid of some of this lines here. The two wars we're going to be talking about, excuse me, the two battles that we talked about at some length were Verdun. So I'll outline the line there, and then looking at the River Somme. So basically in this area here. And what you can see is these are two things called salients. So I will write that for you. Salient. And basically the reason why a salient is a good place for an enemy to attack is they can attack a salient from three sides, as opposed to a flat line like this where they can only really attack it straight on. So they can almost surround their army of the opposition. So same thing here, can be attacked here, the French can attack here. So this is a German salient around the Somme, and Verdun was a French salient. So that's basically why those two wars, I keep saying wars, those two battles occurred there. And one last thing to point out is the River Marne. We talked about that with the Schlieffen Plan. That is the location where trenches were basically set up for 4 years. So you can see that's why all that area around there is shaded. After the Schlieffen Plan failed, there was some pushback from the Allies, but they essentially stayed in the same area pretty much the entire time. Soldier's life. So I want to talk a little bit about this. This one here, some of the gas masks. Note the helmets, actually, of these gentlemen here. That's a Canadian helmet. If you ever go down to Victory Square downtown, they have lamps that are actually made of Canadian helmets. It's kind of a neat thing. But that is how you would identify your own army when you're on the field of battle, is often by their uniforms, and so Canadians had pretty distinct helmets. Moving on from that, let's get that out of the way. Unfortunately, this was a pretty common scene when it came to trench warfare, and often these bodies would be left for a long time. So a lot of disease, dysentery would be happening within the trenches themselves, and of course just even the emotions surrounding the fact that this could have been a friend of yours or someone that you had fought with for months, and now suddenly they're dead and they're lying beside you in a trench. It's something very tough to deal with. Quite often these bodies were left in no man's land and essentially were just buried by shell fire where they lay. So lots of stories about bodies that were never actually returned home to their families because they're somewhere in northern France in a field. It's a pretty sad story. This is actually a nice trench. You can see it's got sandbags. It's a little bit bigger, not too crowded, and it's also deeper. This one over here, you can see that the trench itself the helmets are actually sticking above it, so if it was to be shot at by the opposition or by the opposing armies, then some of these guys could actually be clipped by a sniper. Here, it's a deeper trench they can fit into. You can still see the water in the bottom of it. That was a problem throughout the war. There would constantly be water within them, and in the case of Canadians, if you're given cardboard boots by Mr. Sam Hughes, that didn't work very well for foot disease. And one last picture of a trench. Again, crowded conditions. You can see no man's land in the background where the opposition would be firing at you. So very compact conditions, and again, you're living here for weeks and weeks at a time. Not only that, one of the biggest weapons in a battle of attrition is destroying the other team's morale, and one of the ways they do that is to shell constantly throughout the night, not allow these soldiers to sleep. So you can imagine you've been not sleeping for a few days, and suddenly your commander tells you it's time to run over the top, run across some mud, through some barbed wire and some potholes while shells are going off around you and the enemy is firing machine guns. The romance of war. died with World War I. Some other things about trench warfare. I'm just going to move this one to the front so we can get a good view of it. Trenches, some people think that trench warfare was essentially two big trenches dug on either side all the way across northern France and Belgium. It's a pretty intricate network of trenches that were built. No man's land being in the front here, but there's basically your front line trench, and back here is your support trenches. And even if you went further back, you'd have your medical trenches, so they would be obviously hard to get at by artillery shelling, and in addition to that, you'd have to go through many trenches to get to it. So a lot of support work trenches in this trench system. It was a little bit more intricate than people think, but you can see the barbed wire here for no man's land. Again, barbed wire between each of the trenches. So again, the difficulty of running across mud and then through barbed wire while people in a trench are shooting at you made this a very defensive war, and essentially made the idea of trench warfare very obsolete. Unfortunately, they didn't realize that for 2 years, so millions and millions of young men died because of that situation. Here's a good picture. If I bring it to the front, let's try that again. Over the top, these are men that have basically just been, the whistle's been blown, they're going over the top, and as soon as they go over the top, the machine gun fire starts. If they're lucky enough to make it across no man's land, they may have to weave their way through barbed wire, and if they can do that, then they get to the opposition's trench where they can actually start to fight them. And at that point, a lot of hand-to-hand combat occurs, and if they're able to take the trench, then of course they can get into the trench and start dealing with the second line of trenches on the previous picture. But most of the time, this is not very graphic for a good reason. Obviously, there's a lot worse pictures. You can see this person in the front is not going to make it across no man's land. He's been shot. There's people behind him continuing to run. He couldn't stop. He just had to keep going, because if he did stop to help out one of the people in your company, you would probably be shot as well. Here's an example of one of the large shelling artilleries forward. And I like to show this picture because it is of no man's land in a place that a lot of people know from the poem, in Flanders Field. So this used to be a forest, and you can see what the devastation of artillery fire has done to it, even the land itself being difficult for the soldiers to cross over. So this was not where you could even do a full sprint to try to avoid bullet fire. You're often trying to get your way through different types of trenches and potholes being created by artillery shelling. So getting back to our two battles again. Whoop, I got my pen going here. Verdun and the Battle of the Somme. On these areas, I'll just bring up some maps to highlight some of the things about these two. Again, we focus on these because of just the massive amounts of casualties that happened, and this was sort of the last two big battles that the massive amount of casualties would incur. They had to change some tactics. There became a realization that this just wasn't simply working. So the Battle of Verdun, again, the French salient, was being attacked by Germans, and the Battle of the Somme was actually in response to the Battle of Verdun. They wanted to attack the German fortifications. The British Army did. A guy by the name of General Haig sent many young men, including Canadians, to their death in really a pointless battle. It was done to relieve pressure on Verdun for the French, and there's a lot of debate in some of the revisionist history about whether this guy really knew what he was doing and if he understood the death toll. And particularly for the Battle of the Somme, I think over approximately 400 to 500,000 British troops, or 600,000 German troops, and about 150,000 French troops died in this battle, and it didn't move the line much at all. So, what gains could be made? You could line up the bodies and probably go farther than the actual gains made by the army. But that's a debate about all of trench warfare, is how useful it was, and also whether it was worth the death toll that it took. Here's a better map. Bring that to the front of Verdun. And again, you can see it would be pretty easy. It's a little bit better, if you had your army sort of spread out into many different areas. You're trying to attack. You can be, you're talking artillery shells from many different sides, so it would be difficult for any army to try to defend that. Again, why salients were often attacked by. Come on. bring this one in. That's the Battle of the Somme. It also again does show Verdun down here, but the Battle of the Somme itself. So all these British fortifications here, all these German fortifications here, were where this battle was happening. And again, the ability of the French to attack from this side and the British from this side, that salient was a good place to attack, and again trying to relieve pressure. And I have a better map actually that shows you how little was done in terms of the battle itself. Oh. Gonna have to do some work here, bringing this. Nope, you. No, you. Oh, maybe I can do this. Okay, I think I've figured it out now. Battle of the Somme. To give you an idea of how little was actually gained, given the fact that over 1 million soldiers died. You have your initial line here, the line halfway through, and the line at the end. So basically going through a couple of forests for 1 million lives. That was the Western Front. So we'll look very quickly at the Eastern Front. One thing to point out, if you remember, the Schlieffen Plan failed because of how far the Russians got. So they did get into Germany quite a bit. So some of the fighting on the Eastern Front did happen in Germany, not the Western Front, but the Eastern Front. That was a surprise, if you remember, to the Germans, because they thought it would take 6 weeks for them to even mobilize, and they got in there pretty quickly. You can see Gallipoli down here, which we'll take a closer look at in a second. And then a lot of you are asking where the Austrians come into play, and then here's their Austro-German forces, how far they got. So they got quite a bit into Russia, and by the time of the Russian Revolution, and we'll talk more about that in a few classes, where basically Russia pulled out of the war in what was known as the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, because it happened there. That was the line there, so sort of a midpoint, a saw-off, a stalemate, which we've seen a lot of thus far. So I'm just going to send that to the back. And here we have the Gallipoli battle. Oh yeah, right. I told you guys about the movie. So here's my little preview. There's it looks like. You see Mel Gibson looking very young. So if you ever want to rent it, go ahead. We will not be using it for this course. Here's your Dardanelles. So again, this is this area, and there is the Gallipoli Peninsula. So obviously controlling this controls the entrance to the Dardanelles, and then the supply line through the Black Sea going to Russia was why Russia really wanted to be a part of the Balkans. It was one of their major not environmental, but economic reasons why they wanted to be involved. Some of their political reasons were the protecting of Serbia and some of the other Slavic nations, but really the economics of having a warm or all-weather port, year-round port they could ship to, was huge, because in Russia it gets cold, so all the northern ports are essentially useless. So I can move that out of the way. And this map shows, so you can see it a little bit better, of the peninsula itself. It's kind of a close-up. This being, again, the entrance to the Dardanelles, what they're trying to control. There's your Anzac forces, of which Mel Gibson played a role in the movie Gallipoli, and they were basically trying to attack the Turks. So again, just to refresh your memories, I don't see Italy anywhere in this map, so please get that out of your mind, that it happened in Italy. The 19th Turkish Division were basically fighting the Anzacs. It became a very poor battle for the Anzacs, but yet they still celebrate it as their first involvement in a major conflict. And, whoops, get rid of that. This map here probably shows a bit better. You have Anzacs, you have French, you have Brits landing, all trying to control this peninsula. It was important for the French and the British to control this peninsula as well, because they have economic interests in the area, and it wouldn't necessarily be in their best interest to have Russia control it. So everyone wanted to control the Dardanelles, and the peninsula of Gallipoli was the key point in that. And there's your Eastern Front. All that stuff about militarism, the dreadnoughts being built, the arms race, and there was always this thought of this big, huge battle that was going to eventually occur between Germany and Britain over a long period of time. It did happen in World War II. The Battle of the Atlantic was quite significant. There's a lot of sea battles that we can talk about when we look at World War II in the Pacific Theater, but it never really materialized in World War I. Most of the battles that were happening were U-boats or German submarines that essentially were trying to sink merchant ships like the Lusitania, which brought the USA into the war, from their supply lines to Britain. And other than the Battle of Jutland, they never really had the full-scale, dreadnought battle that they were expecting. So these two maps, they're pretty self-explanatory. You have the British and the Germans trying to control the North Sea. The original thought was that the Germans would be able to destroy part of the British fleet and therefore control the seas, which would be detrimental to British supply lines. It would also stop the British from being able to cross the channel with more troops for the Western Front. But what happened was they were able to decipher German code, and they knew they were going to do it, so they sent more of a fleet than was expected. And even though the Germans sank a couple more ships, in the end the British retained the power of the seas, which was, again, vital for their supply lines. They also were able to stop supplies coming into Germany, which was pretty big, because, again, in a battle of attrition, you need to have resources other than just men, and if they can't get boots, food, etc., and so forth delivered to the men, you lose that battle of attrition. And this one on the right just simply shows how the Germans were encircled. They were not expecting they were not expecting this here. Let's get a little fancy here. This, yes. They weren't expecting these guys coming in, so that was a bit of a surprise. They were encircled, and unfortunately, I should say fortunately for the British, they were able to control the North Sea. Some Canadian content as promised. Vimy Ridge, you can see the Canadian flag there. In the background here is the memorial at Vimy Ridge. If you ever have a chance to go to this area of the world, I recommend you visit it. You see here some Canadian boys on the back of their truck going away. They're very happy. They call this the birthplace of Canada internationally because we put ourselves on the stage. So I'm just going to bring this up to the front and show you a map of the area. Vimy Ridge was extremely important because it was, as the name suggests, a ridge. And so you can see these are the different Canadian divisions. They had to go up this hill. So, oops. Apologies for that. Don't know what I just did, but I'll bring it to the front again. Going up this hill was a difficult process because every time you're in a lower position from your enemy and they're able to shoot down at you, that puts them in a serious, powerful position. So it was heavily fortified by the Germans, but they found a way to get it done. The idea of a rolling barrage was implemented, in other words, shelling in front of the infantry as they came behind it to give them some type of cover. It was brought forward by the Canadians, and again, this was held by the Germans for years. It's 1917 that this happened, and within an afternoon, the Germans had made major advancements up the hill, and after a few days, they had taken Vimy Ridge. So it was a huge victory for Canadians, and that's why we still celebrate it today. The Canadians became known even before this through the Battle of Ypres and Passchendaele, and their involvement in Verdun, as well as one of the greatest fighting forces in Europe. I know that's hard to believe given our present military situation, but the maple leaf, which was not our flag at the time, but was a symbol of the Canadian forces, actually instilled fear in some of the Germans that they were fighting. So I'll just move this back and bring in a couple of pictures here. Oops. Here's your Ross rifle. All right. I'm just going to do some cleaning up here. Here's your Ross rifle blown up for you. Again, to remind you of that, this was some of the profiteering that was complained about during World War I, saying that this rifle, even though it shot straight when dry, would not work very well in the wet conditions of the trenches, but because our munitions minister, Sam Hughes, had shares within the company, or somebody knew had shares, I'm not exactly sure of the whole story, but there was rumors that he had some economic interest within the company. They chose that. After a while, they realized it was not the best rifle to use, so they brought in this one, and this is your Lee Enfield, which is a British rifle that, although it was not as much of a marksman piece, it worked much better in wet and muddy conditions, which is what they faced in the trenches. So a little bit of Canadian content. I'm not going to go into the RAF, but just know that Billy Bishop was our Canadian fighting ace, shot down over 70, I believe, enemy planes, or forced them down. And Rob Brown was another well-known Canadian. He actually shot down the infamous Red Baron. And speaking of the planes, we can start with those in terms of some of the new technology. Again, World War I was a very big transition point. These were old world or old war techniques that were being used in a time when new technology was taking over. So trench warfare was still seen as an effective measure of war. There were past wars where you could go into an enemy's trench much easier than you could in World War I, simply because they didn't have the firepower to keep you back. So someone using a bolt-action rifle or having to get gunpowder out and load it and get 1 or 2 shots off as you're running across no man's land is very different than people in a fortified trench with machine guns that can shoot, multiple bullets per second, basically mowing you down as easy as possible. But starting with our planes. So that's what they looked like. There's a biplane, and again, earlier in the war, none of them had any type of munitions on them. They're having problems with them shooting their own props off, so often it would be used for scouting missions for the most part, just like the airships of like the Zeppelin. So they go out, they find out where the trenches were. They could drop some very primitive bombs that may or may not work, but for the most part they were used for scouts. And a lot of the dogfights were plane versus plane, and they'd actually have to force the other people down. And here's a picture from that time as well. These are 2 of the big guns that did most of the shelling. Again, these would be to either protect the troops moving forward, to shoot at the enemy's trench, or just simply to keep them awake all night. And probably the most effective tool of World War I was the machine gun. Again, it increased its speed throughout the war itself, being able to shoot more bullets per second. And again, in terms of a defensive weapon, it was huge. It would not allow troops to make it to enemy trenches. And finally, the tanks. So we have some examples of tanks down here. This one here is one of your first tanks. This model here became one used later on in the war, but often, no matter what the situation, despite the fact that at the end of the war they were a little bit more effective, again due to technology increases of making it across no man's land, men could run behind them. They obviously could fire munitions themselves, but most of the time they'd end up with a broken track throughout the war. And even though it could be something for you to hide behind, it also could be a place for the enemy to shoot some of their artillery shells. And these things are filled with gasoline, so once they get hit with the artillery shells, they become a bomb in themselves. So a little bit about the technology of World War I. So a brief snapshot of the Western Front, the Eastern Front, some of the major battles, with a little bit of Canadian content. One thing we haven't discussed thus far is the concept of total war. We will get into that, but just know that World War I was the first time that people on the idea of a home front came into play. Most of the time when wars are fought, like for instance the war in Afghanistan that happened recently, your local economy isn't affected very much. World War I and later on in World War II were total wars. In other words, the home front played a large role in it. And again, the idea of having to supply your troops in a war of attrition became just as important as the troops themselves and in the front lines. So you had a war front, or a Western Front and an Eastern Front, and you had a home front. And the home front became vital. And it did affect Canada's economy drastically. Things like war gardens, things like the mothers and wives at home knitting socks, rationing, all that type of stuff came into play. So it was a big piece of World War I and World War II, and something we'll discuss. Hopefully this cleared up some issues for you, and you can use it to take some notes from to help for your studying for this war.